Hello, and welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Chris McCurry.
And I'm Emma Waddington, and today we're talking about anger with Dr. Russell Kolts, moving beyond the typical anger management approach to understanding what it's alerting us to and helping us use the energy to fuel the assertive behavior we need. Russell is a clinical psychologist and professor at Eastern Washington University, author of the wonderful Compassionate Mind Guide to Managing Your Anger and the Anger Workbook. In our previous conversation, secret number 40 on detoxifying masculinity, Russell completely shifted how I think about anger and the cultural messaging we have behind anger. And what we've always loved about talking with Russell is how he helps us see the patterns we've been missing in our work. He's also very honest about his relationship with anger and frustration, which makes these conversations all the more real and useful. So, Russell, welcome back to Life's Dirty Little Secrets.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So, let's start thinking about anger. So, perhaps we can think about that fight or flight piece that you talked about in secret number 40 and how anger used to work really well with our ancestors, but it doesn't seem to work so well sometimes in relationships. Can you help us think about why it is that anger feels so strong and so good sometimes to respond to, but it actually does a lot of damage in our relationships? What is it about anger that happens?
Well, one thing you mentioned in your lead in is people can see anger as being really bad. There are other people that
Mm,
see it really good. Oh, anger is wonderful. They talk about activism and things like that. And I
mm,
think the truth of the matter is that anger isn't good or bad. It simply is, right? It's an evolved emotion
mm,
that evolved to serve certain functions for us, and it serves those functions well. There are some tricky bits to anger that I think have to do with how it evolved that make it powerful uh, in ways that are not necessarily the best fit with modern life, right? In some ways,
mm.
like other emotions, anger is in some ways better suited to the version of human life that we had, say, 50,000 years ago than we have
Yeah.
now. Right, and so anger, when it activates anger, first off, we need to think of anger as a threat emotion. That's really
Mm,
it's one of a family of emotions that really, from an evolutionary perspective, evolved to help us identify and defend ourselves from things that might endanger us. So, we
mm,
have other threat emotions like anxiety, which helps us anticipate potential danger, and fear, disgust, things like this. But we can really think of anger as the sort of the emotional fight in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? And
yeah.
so anger energizes us in a way that really is designed to orient us in an aggressive way, right? Which is,
Mm,
fine if you're fighting off a predator on the savannah, but it's not so fine if the threat is, a comment from your partner or
mm,
a difficult interaction in the boardroom or something like that. But
mm,
in that moment, anger is organizing us to
mm,
to fight, right? It's activating stress hormones, increasing our we get a rush of what and psychologists might call sympathetic nervous system activation, right? So our heart rate goes up, breathing rate increases, blood pressure increases, and it orients us, even the way we think, in a way that's very sort of single-mindedly focused toward fighting off whatever the threat may be. And,
yeah.
in my life, most of the time, that isn't the best response. Most of the stressors that I will face at home or at work will be more nuanced social stressors, right? Rather than
Yeah.
things that will warrant a purely aggressive response.
I do find it quite incredible that our brain can help us switch into this gear so quickly that, 1 minute we're sort of having a conversation with our partner and our partner says something and suddenly we see them as a threat and we are feeling, anger and disgust towards this human who 30 seconds ago we may have been having a really warm and fuzzy moment with. I find it, it's still, well, it catches me. It is an incredible amount of activity to happen and change of perspective to happen so quickly.
It's supposed to be quick. If it were slow, and maybe there were human beings 50,000 years ago for whom the anger response was rather slow, but they got, like, eaten. So, it has to be quick.
Yeah. And I'm glad you pointed that out, Chris, because, most of the tricky things, the aspects of anger that we find tricky today, that we find difficult to manage, are not flaws. They're features, right? They're designed because anger is designed to be a rapid on, rapid off emotion. So rapid on, flood of energy, deal with the threat, and then when it's over, to to kind of shut back down again, go back to baseline. Point I think that Emma, you got me thinking about is, when we're interacting with one another, we're interacting with each other in the present moment, but we're also, in a sense, interacting with our each other's conditioned histories, right? So we all have these historical experiences. These, all my behaviorist friends could go on for hours and hours and hours about how we're shaped by experiences and create various associations in our minds, and learn to be triggered by certain things. We learn that certain things or certain evaluations or certain statements by other people or situations, all sorts of contextual cues mean I'm in danger, right? And so we have these experiences. And so when I'm interacting with you, I've got this whole history of stuff that has shaped me to react with threat to a set of cues that you have no idea about, right? Because we're interacting in the present moment. You don't have my entire history at your beck and call. So you don't know that the way you're speaking to me, you're using the exact phrase that that person who's hurt me so badly 20 years ago used, right? But my emotional memory sure knows that. And that's why, you mentioned anger management. When you get into the nitty-gritty of working with anger, people who really struggle with anger and manifest it in ways that are problematic, a huge part of that is getting to know your anger triggers. This word trigger is a very significant one in sort of the working with anger world, because if we're going to utilize our anger in helpful ways and not be controlled by it, we have to, one of the things we need to do is become very familiar with, okay, these are the sorts of situations that consistently over time tend to trigger anger in me. And then to think ahead of, okay, how do I want to respond when that happens the next time? Right? Because when I'm full rage, right, when I've been triggered and all that threat activation comes up, that is the time I'm least able to come up with useful alternatives, right? That's the sort of time I'm cognitively crippled and I'm just focused in on defending myself from the threat, and my brain is not generating peaceful alternatives, right? So if I do that work ahead of time, if I know that, I get triggered when I pull on the freeway and somebody cuts me off, if I know that every time someone swerves in front of me on the freeway, I get this rush of anger, I can plan ahead for that. And when I'm getting onto the freeway on the on-ramp, I can remind myself of my intention to work with that in a different way, right? And I can come up with a plan for things I can do instead. But I think getting to know our triggers is a really important part of working with anger and not being controlled by it, because we're the ones who will see those patterns. We're the ones who can identify them. Other people largely won't be aware of those things. And, if you've ever been with someone who you're just having what you thought was a normal conversation and they just lost it, it can be really confusing and really disorienting. It's like, what just happened? And what just happened is that person's past reared up in a way that manifested in a present. Something painful there was triggered, and they're in threat.
Well, it would be easy enough just to avoid all those trigger situations. Just don't drive on the freeway anymore. Um, or don't, yeah, but unfortunately, that makes our lives smaller and smaller and smaller. So the courageous move starts with self-understanding, because that can take a lot of courage in and of itself. But then to understand these situations and then actually, if not seek them out, at least not avoid them, because then that becomes like an exposure therapy where we're going into that situation, we feel that stuff coming up, and we're managing it in a better way. And so we learn that these situations can be handled well.
And I think the step before that even, which I think is also a really courageous one, is to be able, and this is particularly true for people with externalized anger, to be able to look at your anger and your angry self as struggling, as having a hard time coping or dealing with an emotion that we're not equipped yet to manage. I think anger can be tricky because we can go a couple different ways with it. It can feel really powerful. It organizes our bodies and our brains in really powerful ways. You know, one of the things that's interesting, there's a lot of research on how people think when they're angry. And one of the things you see is that there is with all threat emotions, there's a dramatic narrowing of thinking and attention, and even fantasy, like mental movies and things, onto whatever the perceived threat is. But with anger particularly, there's also a sense of certainty. There's a sense of certainty. There's a feeling that I know I'm right. Right? There's a feeling of certainty. Why? Because if you're being attacked by a bear, you've gotta be sure. You can't be thinking, "Well, is this an endangered species of bear that I'm fighting? I don't wanna hurt." No, you have to have conviction. It's about fighting, it's about activating, right? So you have this sense of certainty. In the meantime, critical thinking goes down. Stereotyping goes up, right? Our biases increase. Our tendency to accept the words of an authoritative other, particularly when what they're saying sort of fits with our pre-existing biases, that goes up. So in a very real sense, when we're angry, we're more sure that we're right, we're more certain, and we're much more likely to be wrong. And so that's really tricky, but it also, for some of us, for lots of us, can feel really powerful. It can feel really enjoyable, particularly if we look at the rest of our lives and we don't feel very powerful, right? If we don't feel very powerful at work, if we don't feel very powerful in our relationships, that rush of anger and the certainty and the conviction that comes with it can be kind of seductive.
And then we find other people who are angry about the same thing that we're angry about, and that gives us a sense of camaraderie and community, and reinforces our being right, because all these other people are angry about the same thing I'm angry at, so I
Yeah.
must be onto something.
And we see that dynamic being harnessed in real time
Oh,
in
yeah.
these different tricky online communities and you know, I think there's this stoking of the anger and then recruiting the angry people and saying, "We're angry too, join us." And you've got a bunch of people that just aren't thinking very critically there, where they're not doing that work because that's what anger, it shuts that stuff down.
I heard someone say, "We're all think alike, no one thinks very much."
Yeah. You know, I saw one that I don't know if you've seen, they used to have, you know how for a while they had these photos with the inspiring sayings on them, right? So you'd see a sunrise and then there was this place like despair.com or something that did parodies of that. And there
Yes.
was one that had a bunch of hands meeting together and it said meetings. None of us is as dumb as all of us.
Oh, wow.
But
So true.
the other point I wanted to make there, though, is that particularly those of us who struggle sometimes with externalized anger, we can find ourselves saying and doing things that are very hurtful to the people we love the most. And that's very common with anger. When people lose it with anger, you know, they're most likely to lose it with the people they're close to, the people they love. Why? Because that's where they can get away with it. They sort of know that if I blow up at work, no job, I lose my job. If I blow up with my friends, no friends. But my family, they're kind of stuck with me. You know, and so you're more likely to do that. And then the shame kicks, right? If we're honest with ourselves, oh, I just really hurt the people I care most about in the world. That hurts. That doesn't feel good at all. And so we can have these secondary avoidance strategies that with anger don't look like avoidance strategies, right? So, for example, blaming. I only said that to you because you blah, 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 right? If I can blame you for how I treated you badly, then I don't have to feel ashamed for it, right? So, all of these things, the feelings of power, the feelings of shame, all of that, those can be barriers to the first step in working with anger, which is to say, I kind of struggle with anger. I'm having this is an area I have a real hard time with. I think there's like cultural space to struggle with anxiety. There's sort of cultural space to struggle with depression. If we see someone who's anxious, we want to reassure them, right? We want to comfort them. If we see someone who's depressed, we want to comfort them. If we see someone who's struggling with anger, it's like, get away from me. And I don't want to have anything to do with you. So I think it's an act of courage to be able to say, "Look, I struggle with anger. I don't I sometimes do things that I feel really ashamed of, and I don't wanna do that anymore." Or, it feels powerful, but that's not the version of me that I wanna be, in my life and my relationship with the people I care about and as a model for my child or whatever.
I mean, what you're saying is so important is that first step, that recognition that anger, mm, because when I feel a lot of anger, I end up doing things that I really don't like in myself. Like that steps and sometimes can be very difficult. And I remember working with a psychologist a few years back. I can't pronounce her surname, Kira. She's a Irish lady, and she used to talk about the lion and the mouse, how we can swing from being a mouse where we don't say anything, we lay low, we stay quiet, and then we swing into this lion where we sort of roar and get really frustrated, and then the shame kicks in and we swing back into this mouse, and we sort of spend time swinging from one to the other. Because whilst we're in that sort of mouse place, like you were saying, where we don't feel very powerful, we don't have much influence, our voice is very quiet.
Yeah.
We feel quite invisible. And that's where the lion comes in, where you feel really powerful, but actually nobody's listening either. It's not, you're not having a lot of influence necessarily when we get very angry and very upset with people because people just see the anger and mostly, move away. But I do think that that first step where we recognize that it's the way we deliver it that's the problem, as opposed to the fact that we want to say something. It's important to know that behind the anger, there may be something that needs to be said or something that needs to be communicated. And we're not saying don't say it, don't communicate, don't try and reach out and connect. It's more that through the anger, like you said, everything becomes very concrete and black and white, and we see our partner as a threat and we're more likely to harm them. But that there may be a message behind it, I guess, that is important to you, that you've been hurt or you're feeling humiliated or,
Yeah, and sometimes that message is about the relationship. Right, and
yeah,
there are unhelpful dynamics that are in the current relationship. Sometimes that message has nothing to do with this relationship and is
yeah,
about an aspect of our history that
yeah,
we haven't quite figured out yet, right? And so we've got those sort of historical triggers that are manifesting in the present. Um, but I like the way you talked about that shift, the lion or the mouse. Um, and I think it's useful when we think about, the functional parts of anger. I think anger
yeah.
one thing I'll say is that I think anger is a wonderful sign and a terrible strategy most of the
Yeah, I
time,
love that.
right? Which is to say anger is really good at alerting us to stuff that's not okay, right? Stuff
Yeah,
that crosses our values or stuff we're not all right with, and that's sort of cueing us that maybe I want to do something about this now. Maybe I want to say something about this now. And so if we can use some of that energy to provoke us to think, okay, what would be a functional way for me to work with this thing that's activated my anger, right? If we can use some of that energy to do that, it's not a very good strategy, right? Because my angry self, when something, I think is really unhelpful or stupid happens at a faculty meeting, my angry self would love to raise my voice. But you raise
Mhm.
your voice in the faculty meeting, you just kind of isolate yourself. People just kind of shut down, and it's like, right? It's it's not functional. But if I can use my anger, it's like, oh, okay, I'm ticked off about this. This is not okay. And if that can become a cue for me to think, okay, I want to say something about this, what would be a skillful way for me to engage with regard to this? So I think that for anger to be effective in informing, situations or informing behavior in complex social milieus, often it has to be transformed into something else. One I used to have conversations um, around activism, right? When I would do anger workshops or things, there were people that would say, "Well, but anger is really good. I mean, activism." And I consider myself an activist when it comes to several issues. And so, that question came up. I said, "Well, let's go look and see what the science has to say. Are there any studies on anger and activism?" There, you would think there would be. And I looked and looked, and actually at the time I looked at, which is a few years ago, there weren't very many studies at all. But there was one. There was one study looking at anger and fueling energy for activism. And what they said is that anger did promote activism, but people for whom anger was the primary motivator for their activism only engaged in activism that involved the expression of anger. So these were your folks who were more likely to be standing on the street corner holding a sign, yelling and screaming, but they weren't the people that took the skillful action needed actually to change things. They weren't the activist who was putting in the work behind the scenes to actually facilitate social change.
That is such a good example. And it sort of speaks to how anger can feel really good, but not be very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do we use it as a sign or a signal? Oh, wow, I'm really angry. I want to do something about this. And then shift to compassion or conversation with someone we know is both skilled in these sorts of things and level-headed, or, can we use it to fuel effective behavior rather than just fusing with it and running with the energy of anger and acting it out in ways that aren't going to be effective. Because they're actually in modern human life, there aren't very many social situations in which purely acting aggressively out of anger is going to be very functional. Most social situations call for a more nuanced approach.
So should we talk through how we do it? Because it does sound quite complicated. Like, I think, when you were talking about our histories, like there's lots of, especially given how intense anger can feel and how quickly it can raise, rear its head. There's a lot of introspection, understanding our triggers and why. Why do I get triggered when my partner disagrees with me or dismisses something I've said, or whatever it might be? That it feels like we need to spend a little bit of time being curious with what shows up with us.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that curiosity is a superpower, right? I really
Yeah.
think the extent to which we can shift out of any threat emotion really, into a
Mm.
more curious stance. It's hard for me to think of a time in which that's not helpful, right? I really think
Yeah.
curiosity is helpful. But I also think with anger, we don't always have to know the origin of the trigger and what it says. I mean, we may have to go into therapy to figure that out, right? There may be some stuff that we're not.
Years and years of therapy.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. We may not know, but if we can start by just sort of curiously noticing, hey, I notice every time this happens, I I escalate. And I notice that that tends to happen in this context, in this situation, in that context, right? If we've got that information, then we can sort of plan ahead and we can think about, okay, how do I want to respond to this trigger? How do I, what would be useful? And we can sort of, if we understand anger, we can sort of understand that if I just ignore it and decide I'm just going to do differently, uh, it's probably not going to work very well, right? We've got to plan ahead. The analogy I use, particularly if I'm working with groups of men, I've talked about veterans and guys in prisons and things like this, and we talk about this stuff a lot. I'll use the analogy of like drills for soldiers that are going to be in combat, or if you like sport, right? If you like football or whatever, what you see is, in both of those contexts, in sports or in combat and lots of other situations, what they do is they get the athlete or the soldier and they replicate the situation when everything goes wrong. So they practice the side out kick with 10 seconds left in the game, or the you're taking the ball in basketball and there's 10 seconds left and you're down 4 points, or I'm not as good with the specific military examples because I have no experience like that, but there are lots of situations for military training, like you're in a situation and there's a recognition that things just went on wrong in this way. What do you do? And they drill those again and again and again. And they're doing that because they know that in that situation, when threat goes through the roof, people are not very good at problem solving. They're not very good at figuring out what to do. So it's about developing a set of automatic responses and then practicing them so that when the moment comes and you're in that situation, your arousal goes up, but you don't have to problem solve. You just shift into the response that you practiced. You just do the thing that you've practiced again and again. Um, and that you have those automatic responses is helpful, not only in that it gives you options, but it also helps reduce the experience of threat a little bit because there's a little bit of confidence about, okay, I kind of know what to do here. I think there's a recognition of the stimulus features of the situation, or you're like, okay, here's when I do this thing. And so I approach like anger triggers in the same way. If I'm working with clients, I want to identify, okay, what are the conversations or what are the things that happen? And then if you were at your best, right, after we've identified those situations and triggers and contexts, if you were at your best, how do you hope the situation would go? How do you hope it would turn out? What do you hope any action you would take would lead to? And then we can problem solve together. What sorts of behaviors do we think might lead to those outcomes? How might we how might we engage with the situation in a way that honors that this is a significant thing, right? That we want to respond in a way that's meaningful, right? But also to respond in a way that's actually helpful or is actually functional in terms of actually addressing the situation. So, one thing we were talking about earlier was arguing and why arguing isn't a very good strategy, right? I mean, we have lots of people who have discovered the hard way that you can come to an argument with all the facts on your side and all the evidence, and you're just sure that if I just tell this person about all this, they will change their mind and they will agree with me. And it never, ever works, right? And the reason it doesn't work is that if we engage someone in a way that triggers their threat system, particularly anger, what happens? They narrow in. Their whole focus is on defending themselves from the threat, which you have now become, right? You're the threat who's attacking their position. They have a sense of certainty and conviction. Their critical thinking, which you want them to have online so they can consider all your evidence, has just gone offline. And so when we argue with someone, we're not only not shifting their behavior or changing their mind, we're very likely more firmly entrenching them with their existing position because we're positioning them to defend it, right? So if I'm someone who I'm going to Thanksgiving and I know that I've got a family member who's on the complete other side of the political aisle, and they're going to come at me, right? They're going to do that thing where they drop these little things and try to provoke you. And I've sort of gone off several times before. I need to think about, okay, how am I going to handle this so that the anger, I don't get triggered and I respond in a way that fits with the person I want to be. But I also might think about how their anger works. Because if the skillful response that I'm going for involves them being able to consider maybe one or two pieces of evidence that I think are important, then I think would be meaningful to them. Like if they were calm in a vacuum, I know this is a good person. I know if they really understood this to be true, that would matter to them, right? Then I can anticipate, okay, how am I going to manage me and my emotion when I get triggered? And then how can I engage with them in a way that doesn't put them in threat? Right. And in that context, actually, the answer is what you started with. I think the best starting point is curiosity. When the person comes at you in that way to say, oh, it sounds like you feel really strongly about that. Could you explain why that's important to you? Could you tell me what that's all about? And then if they do that and I reflect back and I say, oh, it sounds like you're really concerned about this, or like you're really worried about that. And they go, oh, yeah, that's it. And they feel like you've understood them. Then when I say, would you be interested in my perspective on that? Because I'm happy to share it with you if you'd like to hear, but that's up to you. They'll be a lot more likely maybe to be receptive. Maybe they'll be a little more curious too, But all of that starts with me recognizing, oh, here's that situation again that triggers me. So what do I want to do? Do I want to blow up, create a scene, and feel powerful for 30 seconds and then regret it for the next 3 hours while my wife stares daggers at me? Uh, that's a fictional example. Or, do I want to slow down my breath a little bit and remind myself, yeah, this is that situation that triggers me, and of course it would. I care about this so much, and this is really tricky, but I want to be effective here. So what do I want to do?
You're talking about validating the other person.
Yeah.
And we had a dear friend of mine, Steve Graybar. He was one of our guests a little while back, and he used to say, all behavior is a message, and a behavior won't begin to change until the person knows their message has been received.
I think I think that's really true. I train therapists all the time, and one of the things I talk about pretty frequently is, if you've ever had a client who is kind of on loop, right? Whatever technique you tried to use or whatever direction you tried to take things in, they kept coming back to this thing. They kept saying again, yeah, but there's da 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 da. Well, in my experience, when clients are doing that with me, it's because they don't
Makes
feel like I've understood them.
makes me
What?
angry when they do that.
For much of my career, it did. But then I realized, I finally got to the point. I had a client who would do this a lot. And I was like, oh, this is driving me crazy. And then for whatever reason, I thought, when do I do that? When do I get on loop? And I get on loop, and I do it sometimes. And I do it when it's important to me that the other person understand. And I can tell they haven't gotten it yet. They don't get it. They don't
Right.
understand. And it's
I
really important.
haven't been heard.
I haven't been heard. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I've sort of trained myself as a therapist when I see that behavior. It's like, okay, suddenly my whole agenda as a therapist shrinks down to this one thing. I want to help them feel heard. I want to make sure first that I do hear them and understand really where they're coming from. And then I've got to find a way to convey that to them. And without fail, when I've been able to do that, you can almost see them begin to soften and be willing then to move on and to move to other things.
Right.
So
Right. And there's often something underneath the barrage, the litany of examples of this and this and this and this and this, and trying to like be curious about what's this really about, or what's the theme here. Because when you were talking about recognizing your triggers, there is real value in just being able to go, oh yeah, that again. Oh yeah, another one of these. There's a bit of a in act we would call that a diffusion move where you step back a little bit and go, oh yeah, I'm having these feelings again because of this situation. Yeah, you know, drearily repetitive, but predictable. And okay, so now what do I do? Now that I've recognized it, but we so focus on the particulars of the situation that we're not recognizing that this is just another one of those. But because it's a little bit different from the last time it happened, we focus on those differences and lose the commonalities that could be our cues that I need to do something different here.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought up validating the other person. One thing I want to really highlight about working with anger and actually working with about any tricky emotion truthfully is it's not just about validating the other person. It's also about validating the angry version of the self, right? To pause. And so we don't get caught up in the power or the shame or all that, just to pause and recognize, well, I'm angry. Does it make sense that this would trigger me? Given my history, does it make sense that I would be angered or triggered by? Yeah, yeah, it does, of course, right? And that's about all this stuff that happened in my life beforehand. Of course, I would be triggered by that, but that's not what this interaction is about. Right, right. And just that recognition, if we can, rather than feel ashamed of it, just honor, of course, I would struggle with this.
Right. I like me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that piece, right? There's a simplicity about what you've been saying in terms of the ultimate need is to be heard, like validated, whether, somebody else needs to be validated or whether we need to feel like we're heard and understood, understanding that basic need and the anger functions, that sort of righteousness sounds like it has that function that we want to be right because that helps us to feel heard in ourselves. But we don't need to feel righteous to feel heard. And actually it can get in the way of somebody else. It feels like you're talking about when we have these arguments with others, we're both scrambling to feel heard, and sort of trying to persuade each other, but in the process, nobody's feeling heard. And that sort of
Yeah.
increases the frustration and sort of the situation escalates. And really the bottom line is, with that anger, understanding what is that need that I have and how am I more likely to get that need met? Because sometimes when we're feeling angry, we're not feeling very generous towards the other person at all in terms of validating or wanting them to de-escalate their emotion. But if we can first turn it on ourselves, I guess, and say, actually, what's going to be the most effective way of getting my needs met here, be it to be heard, to be understood, to maybe have some influence, whatever it may be, is coming from it in a way that isn't going to threaten my partner or the other person I'm speaking to. So I think that lens can be helpful because some people, when I've worked with them, get really, especially in couples therapy, will get quite frustrated if they're being told you can't be angry, your anger doesn't work, or, I feel very threatened because they translate that to mean I can't express myself, or my needs don't matter, or you don't care to hear how I feel. But that's, it's really important that that isn't the message, isn't it, really?
Yeah, yeah, and, and there are lots of different ways this working with things and figuring out, better ways of communicating to work. I mean, if you look at dialectical behavior therapy, one of the things that Marshall Linehan did is this whole set of interpersonal effectiveness skills, right? How do we convey? Of course, she was working with a group of people who had anger originally, who had anger problems that were anchored in many cases to the interpersonal interaction itself and to things like not being seen, not being cared about, not, being nurtured. Um, and that's a particularly tricky context because if what I'm activated about is wanting more affection from you or wanting to be heard or wanting to be cared about or wanting to be seen, and I come at you in an angry way, my anger is valid, right? My needs are being met, but I'm engaging with you in a way that actually makes it impossible for you to meet my needs or to want to, because I'm putting you in threat. And so to have those sort of skills, first to recognize it in ourselves and to work to shift the arousal in ourselves, and then to be able to very honestly communicate where we're at in a way that isn't threatening to the person, that's effective. And that's why, one of the things we talk about in anger work a lot, is the kind of rhythm of when I notice, or curiously sort of notice, here's my anger, I work with me first before the situation. I slowed it. So we want that anger to be a trigger, not for the urgently engaging the situation. And that's hard because that felt experience of urgency is a part of the anger, right? That's the anger doing its job and saying, you need to act now, right? And and that's true whether or not the situation demands a response right now or not. I mean, whether I'm going to feel like I need to respond right now, whether that's true or not. That's the energy of the anger. And so if I can learn to recognize that that's actually my cue to slow down my breath or to go for a walk or do something else to work with me to create a buffer so that I can then come back to the situation in a way that's driven by the intention to engage with it in a helpful way rather than just to disperse the energy of the anger.
And I think that idea of drills, I think that was brilliant. I'd never heard of it like that, but it makes so much sense because the automatic response to anger will kick in. Like this is like our ancestry, really playing its part. It's wired. So to drill it like they do in, the army or in, emergency situations where we're
E
drilled to respond a certain way.
EMTs, trauma surgeons,
Yeah.
it's like assess the situation and fall back on your training.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that. I think that's genius, actually. I'll be using that. I think it's
And
really important.
and if you think about it, you can do that, I mean, almost in any context that triggers threat and makes it hard to think rationally at the time. You identify those situations. So in those couple situations, anything to slow it down. I had one particularly tricky couple that just couldn't talk to each other because whenever they try to talk about anything within just a couple interactions, their anger would escalate and they'd end up yelling at each other. And what happens is if you're in a situation like that as a couple, you have a lot of issues stack up that you just haven't dealt with, right? Because in a marriage, for example, there's all this stuff you have to, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about that? And if every time you try to have that conversation, it blows up, it stacks up. So this couple had gotten to the point where they just really needed to be able to have conversations about things. So in compassion focused therapy, we have these three emotion regulation systems that we kind of organize emotions with. So there's threat, which was feeling angry, afraid, anxious, disgusted, right? That's a threat system. Then there's drive, which is interested, engaged, excited. And then there's safeness and soothing, which is calm, soothe, safe, connected, right? And we usually use red for threat, blue for drive, and green for soothing, safeness. And so what I finally did with this couple is I gave them each three pieces of construction paper, one red, one blue, one green. And I said, so here's the deal. We're going to talk about, who's going to do the grocery shopping, or what are we going to do? Are we going to paint the house, or whatever the thing they needed to talk about? But I said, your task is twofold. One, we're going to have this larger conversation, but while you're having the conversation, I want you to hold up a piece of paper that reflects where you're at emotionally. So if you're feeling interested and engaged and excited, you hold up the blue. If you're feeling safe and connected, you hold up the green. And if you're angry, you know, anxious, disgusted, you hold up the red. And here's the deal. You're going to have this conversation, and job one is to have the conversation, but the other job is to keep your partner in either the blue or the green. And as you're talking, if you find yourself getting angry, you hold up the red. And if your partner holds up the red, your job immediately shifts from the conversation to getting them back to the blue or the green. right? Your job shifts. And what I was trying to do is just train them to do, the things all of us do all the time in normal conversation, which is to respond to our emotional experience, to respond to the person we're talking to's emotional experience, right? We do this, right? If you're socially skilled and you're talking about something and someone's face takes on a shape, you're having casual conversation, but then you go over here and their face shifts in a way you can tell they just got uncomfortable. You might back off and go back to more comfortable territory, because the point of the interaction is to have a fun interaction, right? So we're all kind of doing that all the time. But when we get caught up in anger, we can lose the ability to recognize those stimulus cues. So it's hard to miss when someone holds up a piece of red construction
I
paper.
think it's brilliant. I love this. You're absolutely right. Because often in couples therapy, we talk about, the difference between intention and impact, right? The fact is we might have all the best intentions, but it may be impacting our partner in a completely different way to the way we intended. Like we think we're being super skillful, and then they're angry, and we think, well, what the hell? I didn't say anything. What's wrong with you? So actually being much better at, and obviously, like you said, in anger, our tracking system goes out the window. So I love that idea. I'm going to borrow it. I'm going to
Well,
have
we
to go
can
and get some
use
colored
that
paper
with our teenage children.
also. Yeah. We use it, or they use it, or we both use
Well,
it.
you'd both use it, yeah. I mean, if you're
Yeah.
gonna,
I think it's
if you need
brilliant.
to have that difficult conversation, slows things
True.
down. No, that's great.
Yeah. I
So,
love that.
in the interest of time,
Yes.
final thoughts.
I guess my final thoughts would be to say to anyone who's listening, if you struggle with anger, don't beat yourself up for that. It's not your fault. You didn't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to struggle with anger. This is going to, there are lots of different ways we can get to that place. And so maybe it's worth, instead of, beating ourselves up for struggling with it or pretending like it's not happening, to just say, yeah, actually, I recognize myself in some of this. I have a lot of conversations where I leave in a huff, or, whatever the things are. And I don't want to do that anymore, you know, and to recognize that making that choice is an act of courage, actually. And then it doesn't feel manageable to play around with it on your own. It would be a good time to touch base with a therapist or someone else who can kind of help you navigate those waters. And if you're not sure, then maybe start by just trying to get curious and, sit and reflect. Okay, what are the situations in which I tend to get triggered? What are the ones that tend to send me off? And, you know, uh, how would I want to engage with those situations in a different way?
Yeah.
And to try and get curious about that, and what would help, like to think, if when I get triggered, maybe it would be worth slowing down my breath for a minute or two, and maybe come up with a little bit of a plan. But I think it all starts, I think once we sort of recognize, oh, this is a challenge for me, and I'm not going to beat myself up for it, but I want to do better, right? We sort of create an intention to do that. Then to think creatively and think, okay, well, how do I want to engage in those contexts, and what might be helpful in moving me in that direction, and then accessing help if we were struggling, which often we will.
So we will have your books in the show notes for today's
Oh, cool.
podcast. So listeners can seek those out, and those are very, very helpful resources.
And
Yes.
the
And the
thing,
TEDx talk, which was lovely too.
Yeah, your
oh,
TEDx
Put
thank
that
you.
in
talk.
there.
Thank you.
We'll have all that.
The anger workbook is really it's kind of a self-help focus. It's arranged in modules, so therapists can cut out modules and copy them and use them. But it really, the thing I really like about it is it's not just about how do I, deal with anger. It's about how do I build the kind of life I want to have. That's the real focus.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
about containing or getting rid of or reducing. It's about how do I want to be and how do I facilitate that.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. In the service of anger being a good signal, but a poor strategy.
Unless, we're being attacked by a wildebeest or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, which hopefully that's
Fight
unlikely.
away.
Yeah, those
Forget
wildebeest.
about that. Forget about curiosity. Yeah.
See, what is a wildebeest doing in Seattle?
Yeah. Exactly.
That is scary.
All right. Well, thank you so much,
Wonderful.
Russell Kolts.
Yes.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been wonderful.
Well, thanks
Really
for
has
having me.
been.
It's always wonderful.
It's been a delight. Thank you.